Hello, right, greetings. Thomas Stafford here for my weekly Sunday talk. It's a beautiful day here in the middle of France, and I'm speaking on 6th of September. It's Sunday, and I'm going to be sharing today about one specific topic, which is related to all the others that I've addressed. I've talked obviously a lot about Brexit in these talks. I've talked about the COVID situation that we're all suffering from, and wars in the Middle East, Palestine, Israel, the Lebanon bombing, Iran, the dangers of conflict and so on. So I'm speaking as a peace expert, a philosopher and a historian. Today I'm going to be mainly speaking about the events of 9/11. On September the 11th, 2001, because we're coming up to the anniversary, the 19th anniversary, and I'm going to be organising a conference. I'm going to be launching a conference, which is the first ever gathering of historians to discuss this. I have a love of history. I've always loved history since a boy. My father used to take me around the English Civil War battlefields, Edgehill and so on. He came from Warwick. And, I was brought up in England to have a great love of history. I used to go visiting sites and travelling and so on. And then when I did my A-levels, I did history, and I did ancient history, in fact, because I love the whole of history, the joined-upness of it all. That's why I got interested in religions and philosophy, because I discovered in ancient history it's teeming with philosophers and sages, Socrates, Plato, Buddha, Lao Tzu. They all belong to ancient history. If you don't ever study ancient history, you never get a feel for religions. Well, I got the feel, and then went and did my history degree at the University of London. And I got very interested in academic and scientific studies of history, and I sat at the feet of all the great professors at the university back in the 1980s. I specialised in East-West, East European, Russian, Soviet, Western relations, the Cold War, because I was doing it to try and stop the Cold War and the annihilation of humanity by nuclear arms. And I launched Historians and Philosophers of Peace. We used to meet in London and in Notting Hill Gate in the 80s, and I was part of that peace movement, trying to prevent nuclear annihilation through academic research. I got involved with peace research at the University of London, creating a centre. I worked for several years at the Institute of Education, trying to bring scholars, academics from throughout the UK and globally to come and use London as a centre. I then organised meetings in the House of Lords for scholars, academics to meet with politicians, Lords, MPs, to discuss policy and peace. And I brought in faith leaders and so on. That was during the 1990s. And I launched an institute based at the university to begin with for all these things. And everything, in the 1990s, it looked like we were going to get a sort of rational solution to the Cold War. Treaty of Paris in 1990 had solved that. And we were talking about a peace dividend, all the money that was going on Cold War sort of fears and weapons could now go to peace. We could solve unemployment. We could solve global environmental problems, human rights problems. There was a sort of sense in the late 90s that we were on the right track for, a rational, peaceful world order. And then 9/11 happened, 2001. I'd been to New York several times, speaking at the UN about peace studies. I'd met academics, philosophers, thinkers. I'd met people in New York at the UN headquarters who were representing their own culture, their own university system. We were discussing what we could do to advance peace research in each other's countries. I met people from Russia, from America, from all over. We were all talking about how we can make a more peaceful world. I'd been to Israel. I'd met Israeli scholars. I'd interviewed Israelis and Palestinians in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and all the rest. There was nowhere that didn't seem to have signed up to the peace agenda. I'd also taught at the Muslim College, which was run by my friend Dr. Zaki Badawi. It was the most important postgraduate Islamic research institute in Britain, one of the most important in Europe, and it was a wonderful intellectual adventure, teaching very clever Islamic students, postgraduates in intellectual history. My job was to do a sort of crash course on the history of Western philosophy for them. And I remember taking a bunch to the Freud Museum in Hampstead, and that was great. I was trying to explain Freud to Muslim advanced thinkers, and we agreed that Freud was right on some things, probably not on others. And by then I'd also been studying Sufism for many years and comparative spirituality and so on. So anyway, 9/11 came. It hit us like out of nowhere. And all the piecework I'd been doing, all that sort of gradualism of moving towards a rational, peaceful world order, seemed to collapse suddenly with those buildings in New York. We all watched horrified. I was in Shropshire. I had a beautiful walk on the Long Mynd on that day in September. I remember it well. I was with my then partner, who was a Sufi as it happens, and we went for tea at the hotel in Church Stretton, I think, and it was a beautiful September day. And suddenly she came into me, white as a sheet, and said, "Thomas, you better come and watch this." And in the hotel foyer were playing the planes flying into the Twin Towers and all that. And we watched utterly aghast and drank our tea in shock and horror. And really nothing's been the same on the world since, in my opinion. Tony Blair got one thing right. He said this has changed everything. And because I knew New York, I know and love New York. I mean, I'm part of me is a New Yorker. I was born just up the road in Montreal, and it's one of my favourite cities on the planet, as well as all the others. I couldn't choose. I was deeply upset by all this, and I immediately said, "Look, we've got to find out who did this." And I listened as the media immediately jumped and said, within about a few hours, it was saying, Bin Laden, Al Qaeda, Well, as a historian, I knew that Bin Laden for many years had been one of us, a Western supporter, and had been helped by American and British intelligence with funding, weapons training, and had been part of the team. Not my team, I hasten to add, because I'm a man of non-violence, but the British intelligence and American team that had made a decision to help the Mujahideen against the Soviet invasion in '79, and it didn't ring true. Why would Bin Laden, suddenly be doing this, and how could he have technically done it? Anyway, I said, let's suspend judgment, and I continued to suspend judgment. I still do to this day. The fact is, we don't know actually who was responsible. In November of that year, I organised a mini conference, educational conference, at the Gladstone Library, St Daniel's Library, up in North Wales. I was then living, on the borders of Shropshire and Wales. And I organised a really interesting conference. It was recorded. We didn't have really films in those days to film it. And many very interesting speakers came, including Jane Goodall. She spoke about aggression in human beings, and is it hardwired? And Prince Frederick von Saxe-Lauenburg helped me organise it. We had Buddhist speakers, we had academics and so on, interested in peace research. And in the wonderful environment of St Daniel's Library, which was Gladstone's private library, the great liberal Prime Minister of Britain, who very much strongly believed in ethics and foreign policy should be intermingled. He opposed the kind of cynicism that he identified with Disraeli and the Conservatives. He believed in an ethical foreign policy. He was a friend of Schliemann. He was an actual intellectual, Gladstone, a Christian liberal democratic reformer who wanted to advance the well-being of not just the middle classes and the upper classes in Britain, but everybody, the poor, the displaced. And he also felt justice for Ireland involved elements of home rule. and so we were pleased to meet in that environment. And it's interesting, Gladstone left that library to the nation for divine learning. That's the trustee deeds. You can still go and stay there for a week and read there. So at that point, I was still suspending judgment. The media was all about Bin Laden. And then suddenly, it was all about Iraq. And before you could blink, the Western American British media had suddenly pumped out all this vitriol against Saddam Hussein, who had nothing to do with 9/11. Anyone with a brain of any kind, let alone someone who's researched the whole history of the Middle East and modern politics, as I had done, knew. I mean, this was just hysteria and mass propaganda. And with hindsight, looking back on that time, it was unbelievably cranked up. So when 2003 came, and essentially just about a year after, I was one of the probably 2 million people that marched in London down Park Lane to say, no, we don't want to invade Iraq, because we knew it had nothing to do. We still hadn't even got definite proof of who'd done 9/11. And now we were going to invade a sovereign country that we'd helped build. I mean, the British academics had helped establish the University of Baghdad. Joan Baez's father, a great folk singer, her father had taught there. Agatha Christie had been involved in Iraq, and her husband and she had worked in archaeological stuff. And that's where she got the plots of a lot of her novels, was travelling out back and forth to Iraq by train. Iraq is our culture. There were people there that were translating T.S. Eliot into Arabic, professors at the Department of Literature there. And why would we suddenly, go and attack and kill them all for... it was a completely irrational, illogical and illegal undertaking. But of course, 9/11, it was like the sort of start of a load of ninepins of... Now, with hindsight, looking back, the mystery of who did 9/11 needs solving. Now, that's my starting position. And so, a couple of years ago, I started writing a book about it, which I published last year. It's the first ever historical study of the events of 9/11. I'm going to share the contents with you. At the time of 9/11, I was busy writing my PhD thesis for the University of London, which just happened to be a study of the search for peace from 1945 to now. And I was looking at it through the lens of philosophy, and I looked at the role of great thinkers and philosophers during that timeline, 45 to 2001. Then I looked at historians, what great historians have talked about peace and how we can use history as a tool for achieving peace. People like Toynbee and all the great historians of our time. I also looked at religious thinkers and theologians because, the search for peace is an ethical crisis. It's a dilemma that affects people that think religiously, because people that think religiously want to join everything up and think, from the lens of higher consciousness. So how can we find peace without factoring that in? So I did a whole chapter on that. And this is the thesis. It took me... I was in the middle of writing it when 9/11 happened. And it was a huge amount of work. But I hope it was, I enjoy academic work and scholarly work. So I did it in real detail. And it was being written up as those events were unfolding. And I'm going to just summarize I'm going to read the abstract because I think it's relevant, okay? This thesis contributes to the intellectual history of the period from 1945 to 2001 in the specific regard of the search for peace among selected groups of intellectuals, academics and thinkers during the Cold War epoch. It concerns itself both with the quest for peace in relation to that complex, global, bipolar conflict, and also more generally. It examines this search in 4 specific fields of knowledge, namely historiography, philosophy, religious studies and theology, and psychology. It constructs a chronological narrative in each separate knowledge field, covering the main events and publications and thought movements. It is admittedly selective. The thesis as presented has not included a large section written up on a psychoanalytical, psychopathological contributions to evolving peace theory. Whole chapters were originally conceived to cover the history of the evolution of peace thinking in relation to the history of political theory, international relations, natural sciences, anthropology, and cultural studies. All important. These have had to be postponed or published elsewhere, as the prioritised areas were also hugely challenging. Furthermore, the choice was to go for depth rather than breadth, as the thesis also highlights a methodological lacuna that emerged during the course of the research. Developing from the dialectical relationships between the history of ideas, intellectual history, the history of philosophy, the philosophy of history, the history of psychology, the history of religions, the theology of history, and the search for an intellectual history of peace theory, it was felt that a new meta-historical discipline, transpersonal history, might assist the work of trying to make sense of our epoch, and particularly provide a useful historical specialised sub-discipline, which might hopefully help shed light on the causes of religious and intercultural conflicts and their possible resolutions in the post-9/11 world. Right, so that's the abstract, which a thesis traditionally has, that summarises the intention of the author. And, you know, you've got to bear in mind this is being written up as 9/11 happened, as the war in Iraq happened in 2003, and all the consequences. It also coincided with my training, in addition, as a religious studies teacher and philosophy teacher in the UK educational system. I did what's called a PGC, which qualifies you to teach in the schools. In Shropshire and Herefordshire, the Welsh Marches, where I lived for 10 years. And I began teaching, initially in Wales and then in schools around England. And I spent 10 years working in the education system whilst the thesis was being finalised and then finally approved, you know. And I passed the Viva and all that. I'm going to read the argument, which is kind of the nitty-gritty hub of the thesis, right? The history of recent historical, philosophical, theological, and psychological thought and peace research, 1945 to 2001, reveals that 1. Poor philosophical understanding and rival schools of philosophical knowledge being in contention can help cause wars and violence, or at least can fail to solve and transform them. 2. Poor religious understanding, based on narrow, literalist and contradictory exoteric theological hermeneutics, exegesis and practice, can help cause wars and violence through the contending of rival systems of salvation, or at least can fail to solve, transform and prevent them. 3. New developments in transpersonal psychology have revealed peace psychology to be an extremely complex and interlocking system, premised on deep self-awareness and transpersonal cognition, in which the full dimensions of human spirituality and rationality and unconscious psychological drives can be harmonized and reconciled, and within which various rival schools of philosophy, theology, and metaphysics can be mapped, integrated, and synthesized. 4. new developments in historiography can embrace the findings of transpersonal psychology and thereby gradually evolve an awareness that historiography can contribute rationally and systematically to the healing of the deep fissures in mankind's soma and psyche, and thereby contribute towards the development of the wider peace sciences as an educational project of lasting benefit to mankind. Now that's the argument, and so that took me, well, it took me a long time to, write the whole thing up to the standards expected of a professional academic PhD from the University of London. I had a 100,000 word limit, and so I couldn't put in the chapters on science and law and international relations that I'd originally hoped. So I've written them up separately. They're not all finished yet. But it was passed, I got the thesis in 2008, and then I watched the world in turmoil since 9/11. And it seems to me that what happened on that day, on 9/11, 2001, was an unsolved mystery. And I feel the historian is like a detective. The reason I love history is because, like Herodotus, I love travelling around. I'm a geographer as well, and visiting interesting places and asking lots of awkward questions. So when I was in New York, I asked lots and lots of questions. When I was in fairs in Morocco or Israel, Palestine, or Tel Aviv, or Jerusalem, everyone I'll meet, and I often mingle with intellectuals at quite a high level. I'll ask them what they think about this kind of stuff. The thesis came out of travelling to over 35 countries around the world and asking academics, philosophers, historians, theologians, educators, what they're doing for peace. What more can we do? In Moscow and in Russia, in talking to people at the Institute of Philosophy, which is their sort of main centre for advanced thinking, in New York at the UN headquarters, and in California, and Harvard and elsewhere. And so all that got into the thesis. Now, so I listened, I watched in the 2000s as the narrative of, Bin Laden did 9/11, Al-Qaeda helped him, let's go and attack, let's invade Afghanistan, and I watched the jingoistic nationalism of America and the Bush dynasty leading it astray. I mean, I was very skeptical about this whole thing. The Gladstone conference we had was skeptical about. I mean, my view was that the answer was education. I still take that view. If it was extremist Muslims behind the whole thing and they were sort of really riled up, well, then we need to talk to them and find out what on earth they're going on about. Like, how does knocking down and destroying the lives of thousands of innocent civilians of an ally that had been helping the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets, how does that help advance peace? How is that in any way, shape or form properly Islamic? I've read my Quran, I've studied with Sufis, I've learned at the feet of Muslim scholars. That was not an Islamic action. And I was very suspicious that could be blamed on the so-called Islamic terrorists. The whole idea of Islamic terrorism seems to me a misnomer. Muslims don't use terror on the whole. They fight like face to face if they have to when it's decreed, but always try to not, go to war. And I've studied in detail, Islamic teachings on war and jihad and so on. So it's then I met someone who came over from the States to teach a conference with me on sacred mathematics and symmetry and so on, and who was the first person that I'd met from the States who was 100% convinced that the narrative on 9/11 was false. She was a learned lady, an expert in the Enneagram, and she just, dented my sort of trust in the media. I'd always thought up to that point that must be Al-Qaeda, that's what the media says. But she was revealing to me stuff from the perspective of someone living through it all in America. And they were questioning the narrative. And this was in about 2003-04. And, I didn't pursue the matter at that point. I was finishing the doctorate thesis, I was teaching, I was a very busy man working full-time as a religious studies teacher by then. But I put it on the back burner. I said, one day I'm going to have to look into this, So that came. I restarted some of the meetings in the House of Lords I'd been running, and we discussed some of these issues to do with policy and ethics. And we had a few meetings in the Commons. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I then decided, having moved to Scotland and lived there and taught and worked on various, studies of comparative religion and philosophy and theology and so on. When I moved to France, I decided to bite the bullet and write the book on 9/11 because nobody else had done it. And although there were lots of journalists, lots of engineers, architects, people jumping up and down saying 9/11 was partly an inside job, no historians had really, apart from one or two, like Webster Tarpley and others, who actually trained as historians, nobody had actually got involved in analysing the history of 9/11, which I felt was a terrible lacuna. My doctorate stopped at 9/11 as a historian, and I felt I had a duty to then carry on the narrative. So I was doing a lot of research through all kinds of media, and when I came here to France, I had the time, the space, the energy and the resolve to then spend a year of very intense daily research and writing. Once I get going, it's a dedication of a professional scholar, historian, to really find out the facts. And I then spent a year writing this book, which was published last year in, I think, February. And it's the first, it remains the only proper, comprehensive historical and philosophical survey of what 9/11 was, how it happened, how it might have happened, what its implications were, and so what. I encountered the so what a lot as a teacher of religions. I would give a brilliant lesson on whatever, Muhammad and the Quran, or Jesus and the cross, or Buddha and enlightenment. And, I think it was like gold star. And the kid, somebody in the class would sit down and say, well, so what, sir? There's like the so what response. I'm used to it. So I put that in, so what? Okay, so the book is called The Prolegomena to a History of 9/11. So I pinched the phrase from Kant. It's a foreword. I'm not professing to have written the definitive history of 9/11. We're not at the stage where that's even possible yet. There's still so many, it's like a party where the building's falling down, there's shouting on the pitch, people outside are, jumping into the pool. You can't, write the history of this because it's all still happening. But this is how we can write it. It's a prolegomena to a history of 9/11. Subtitled Critical Questions, Critical Times. A historical and philosophical study of 9/11 towards a historical commission of inquiry into 9/11. Well, that title tells you everything, really. This is what I'm setting up in 6 days' time, or whatever, on the 11th of September this year. Finally, 2020. Why should it be me? Why aren't professors at Harvard and Yale and London and Oxford and Cambridge, why haven't they come together with a secretariat in the UN and staff of 50 researchers and a budget of $1 million or 10 million, pounds a year? That's what this needs. And by the way, professors from every country, Arabia, Israel, Palestine, Iran, it's in everybody's interest to find out the truth of what happened on 9/11, is my argument. It's in nobody's interest to cover it up, apart from if anybody was involved in it that wants to then silence and cover their tracks. Because it was a criminal event. This was a crime on a gargantuan scale. We'll come to that. So anyway, it's a prolegomena, and that's why I'm setting up the commission. in a few days' time. It's grown out of the book. We're going to be meeting on Zoom. People with expertise are being invited. The full commissioners are going to be trained historians with at least a PhD. This has got to have credibility. This is not a sort of crank thing. This is a proper academic historical study of the most cataclysmic event of our lifetimes, which incalculably changed the world, as Tony Blair said. And I agree with him on just about everything about that, apart from his stupid invasion of Iraq, which was illogical, irrational, and illegal. And I'm hoping he can even give evidence to our commission eventually, as a witness. So anyway, I'm going to just summarise the contents because I think it's quite exciting, and I've never shared this before in public. Only my close friends and allies know what I've been up to. So the table of contents is part 1 is called Why History. This is the why question. I've had kids in classes say to me, why should we study history? It's all in the past. Why? Okay, this is my answer. So it begins with a personal introduction. Why I love history, why I'm a historian, why I'm a devotee of Herodotus, the gift of Hera. I then go on to discuss the silence of historians. Why are no historians have done this job before? Why is it just down to me, for God's sake? And then I talk about the necessity of history. You see, if we don't remember history, we're condemned to repeat the mistakes. The reason we study history is because it's part of the healing process it's got an ethical function. Herodotus, and then I go on to discuss Herodotus. And his mission, why he invented history, was to find out why on earth the Greeks and the Persians were having the biggest, most gargantuan conflict in history up to that point. Why were the Persians invading little Greece? Why were the Greeks not just lying down and dying? Why did they bother fighting back? It was a peace, irenic project, history. And it was about inquiry. The word history means inquiry. It doesn't mean knowledge about stuff in the past. That's what it's come to mean, but actually in Greek it means inquiry. So a historian is someone that studies everything. Everything has a history, because everything has a time dimension to it. And it's the time dimensionality of things that history studies. So anyway, I talk about that, and I talk about the importance of healing as the function of history. It's the craft, right? So there's a big overlap between Herodotus and Hippocrates. They were from about the same era. Hippocrates was inventing scientific Western medicine with the help of the gods. He didn't lose his piety. And so Herodotus was inventing sort of social medicine through inquiry, which is like doing the diagnoses of the medical doctor. In Western medicine, the doctor's diagnosis is critical. It's true in other forms of medicine. I'm not, trumpeting just Western medicine here. It's a universal thing in healing rubrics. And so is history. And it was separately invented by Sima Qian in China and other, historical traditions. But the one I was interested in to begin with was Herodotus. I talk about then, the next chapter is my own thesis, the idea of transpersonal history, which as we look at the history of the soul, we look at the altered states of consciousness of prophets and sages in history. Is this the evolution of mind? Is history the unfolding of the collective noosphere that Teilhard de Chardin talks about? What's the purpose of history? Where's it going? What's the end? What's the narrative here? So I talk about transpersonal history and the collective individual flourishing